All right, welcome everyone to today's Google Webmaster Central Office Hours Hangouts. My name is John Mueller. I'm a Webmaster Trends Analyst here at Google in Switzerland. And part of what we do is talk with webmasters and publishers like the ones here in the Hangout. As always, I'd like to give those who are kind of new to these Hangouts a chance to ask the first couple of questions. If there's anything on your mind, feel free to speak up.
Yeah, I'm having a question.
All right.
Yeah. So I was just curious that how can I optimize my website for Sysnum? So
For
in Czech Republic, if I'm familiar with English language, but if I want to optimize my website for Czech language, so how can we do that stuff? Because we are not very good at this translating stuff and how Google can actually understand these kind of error in the translation mistakes stuff.
Yeah. So I guess the first step is really to make sure that you have high quality, unique, and compelling content for the Czech Republic. That the translations are done properly, that you really have something that's unique that you can offer them. And then things like geo-targeting might be an idea to really specifically target that country. Also, the hreflang links, if you have content in other languages, like you mentioned in English already, and it's equivalent content, then the hreflang links can help us to understand the relationship between those types of pages. So those are probably the main technical SEO things I would focus on. But in general, you really need to make sure that your foundation is strong, that you have something great that works well for the Czech Republic.
Okay, so okay, thank you.
All right, more questions from any of the new faces in here? Otherwise, I'll jump over to the Q&A. Let me just mute some of you. There's a little bit of background noise. Feel free to unmute if there's something on your mind that you'd like to add to a question or a comment. All right, let's get started. It took 10 months for Google to launch the last Panda update from September 2014, July 2015. Can we say the slow rollout of Panda might take 10 months in general? I wouldn't necessarily say that because it was like this in the past, it will be like that in the future. So that's not something where I'd say there's a real relationship between those. Does Google use time on page and bounce rate as a signal in rankings? And if so, what can you say about that? So these are traditional things that you would track with something like Google Analytics. And we don't use Google Analytics for rankings at all. We don't use that for search in general. So that's something where we wouldn't tie that in. The one place we do use some kind of user signals is when we're evaluating algorithms in general, when we're testing which algorithm is better. And we can look across millions of search results and millions of different sites and say, well, in general, this algorithm is performing better based on the aggregated signals. But on a smaller level, that's not really easily possible. So to the best of my knowledge, that's not something that we would do there. Let's say you send 1,000 visitors to a page. Do you look at behavior stats like 300 users found what they were looking for, 400 users spent some time but searched more, 300 users came back to the page and bounced back to the search again? Does this alter rankings? Again, this is essentially, like I mentioned before, we do look at some of these things on a very broad aggregated level. When we look at like millions of sites, millions of search results, that's something where I think there is reasonable value to gain from there. But on a per-page basis, that's usually not easily doable. How to stop reporting irrelevant 404 errors in Search Console after recovering a hacked website, and when those 404 pages will never come back. These errors show up every day for months. they'll continue showing up because Google has a very long memory, and we'll continue retrying them, and you'll continue seeing them in the Search Console and the error section as well. This is something where, in general, you don't really need to take action on these. It's not something that we would see as a problem for crawling, indexing, or ranking that a site has a lot of 404 errors. That's essentially a part of technical life on the web. Content comes, content goes. It returns 404 for a really long time. We just check those URLs because we think maybe we're missing something fantastic from this website, and we don't want to kind of ignore that just because it was a 404 in the past. What is the effect of headings if I have one H1 or if I don't have an H1? So headings in HTML give us a little bit of understanding of the structure of the page, of the context of the different text pieces you have on the page. So that's something I would definitely use to your advantage in that you can tell users a little bit more about what this page is about, the main topic of the page. And it also is something that we can pick up for search. So that's something I would definitely use headings on a page like that. The thing to keep in mind there is it's not that we're going to say, well, these 5 keywords are found in the heading, therefore we'll rank the site #1 for these keywords. That's not really how it works. It's more of a more granular level in that it helps us to understand the context of the text that you have on your pages. In the last German Hangout, you said you don't use user search behavior. Does this mean if users searched and found what they were looking for via my page, it won't boost the rankings of that page? I think we've talked about that a bit here in this Hangout. Like I mentioned, this is something that we use to try to understand algorithms better, but it's not necessarily something that we would use on a per-page basis.
It still incidentally boosts the rankings, though. If more people find your page, stay on your page, share your page, then
I mean,
indirectly. It can't not, yeah.
Indirectly, obviously, that's something that helps. And also, as a webmaster, if you're seeing that users like your page and they keep coming back and they spend a lot of time on your website, then you're doing a good job. Whereas if you see that they're coming to your pages and they're bouncing away again, or they're not really finding what they're looking for, not converting, then that's something you might want to focus on as a webmaster. On an aggregate level for search rankings and determining the relevance, that's a very different situation. How to target near me keywords in the web. So as far as I know, this is mostly something that triggers the local search results. So whatever you can do to kind of make sure that your site is recognized as having a certain local presence, which could be marking up the location on your pages using structured data, for example, making sure you have a Google My Business listing set up properly. These are things that help us to better understand where your business is located and that it's located in a very specific place, and people will be able to kind of go to your business and do whatever they're trying to do. Not many of our products are indexed. We have no robots file and no valid sitemap. Our site has over 200,000 pages and resources to be crawled, given there's no disallows. Could this be why only a couple of products have been indexed? I'm not really sure of the specific situation here, so this is something I'd probably have to look into in more detail. One thing I'd recommend doing here is posting in the Webmaster Help Forum, where other people can give you some general advice as well to kind of guide you in the right direction in the beginning and to help you recognize that there's something really, really weird with your website maybe where you do need special help from Google. But for the most part, these are issues that people have a lot of practice with, and they can probably help you in one of the Webmaster forums. I've changed the content in the page, but Google didn't crawl even after 7 days when I checked the cache page. Since I'm a dynamic site, how do I intimidate Google? I don't think you want to intimidate Google in general because, I don't know. It's probably not a very smart move, but in general, what you can do in a case like this where you're updating content on your page and you're seeing that Google isn't picking that up properly, there are a number of things that you can do. On the one hand, you can link to it from your home page, for example. If this is new or updated content, then sometimes you have a section on your home page on the sidebar maybe that says this is new stuff. It's new stuff that has been happening, new products that are available. That's one option. Other more technical things you could do is set up a sitemap file with a last modification date. And then you can ping that sitemap file. Sometimes your CMS will do that for you to let us know that the sitemap file has changed. And we'll go through those URLs, look at the last modification date, and see if there's something new that we might be missing. And then we'll go off and actually try to crawl that. And finally, if this is just a one-off situation where this is one page that you're changing, and you don't really want to set up a sitemap file, and your website is kind of small and not really something that's crawled a lot in general, then you can use Search Console, the fetch and render feature in Search Console. There's an option to submit that page to the index. It'll generally be crawled within maybe a day or so and be picked up for indexing from there as well. The one thing you also mentioned in this question is that you check the cache. In general, the cache is not always representative of what we have actually indexed for a page. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. That's not really where you'd need to go to double check that we've actually indexed this content. What I might do instead is to do something like a site query for that URL or for some keywords that you've changed or modified on that page to see that we can actually pick that content up properly. Also, one more keyword in your question. You mentioned it's a dynamic site. So if this is a JavaScript-based website, then we have to actually render those pages to pick them up for indexing. And those are things that we wouldn't show at all in the cache. So if it's a site that uses a JavaScript framework like Angular or Polymer or any of the other frameworks out there, where the HTML page itself is essentially pretty plain and not something that contains the content, then you wouldn't see that in the cached page. One thing you could do in a situation like that, if you want to take the extra step and make sure that Googlebot can actually pick up that content, you could use something like isomorphic JavaScript, which is a way of rendering your pages on the server and sending the rendered version to users. So that's something you might want to look into. But in general, if I take this question as something coming from a more beginner webmaster, for example, then I'd just say make sure you have a sitemap file, make sure that we can pick up the sitemap file and that we can crawl your pages, and don't worry too much about the cache page. That'll catch up over time.
Hello. Yeah, can you just repeat that? Which kind of JS you recommended for this rendering of web page?
Isomorphic JavaScript.
Isomorphic JavaScript.
Yes.
Okay. So actually, I was working on the Paytm. So in that, they used to create two versions of our website, one for the Google bot and one for the user. So they used to submit the one for the Google bot. So they used to send the simple static HTML pages to the Google, and those JavaScript pages for the users. So they were complaining regarding the server usage, like server usage. So
yeah, so if they're using something to pre-render the pages and create static HTML versions just for Googlebot, then that's something I'd kind of double check on to make sure it's actually working properly. Because if you're doing that just for Googlebot, it's very easy to get some bugs in there where the rendered version isn't actually the correct version to send. So that's kind of one thing I would watch out for with isomorphic JavaScript. You send the same rendered version to both Googlebot and to users in the beginning. So that makes it a lot easier to debug what is actually happening there with regards to Google.
how many H1 tags and H1 to H6 tags, how many of them I can use in a page? And if I use the like 5 to 6 or like 10 H6 tags or H4 tags, will that create a negative effect on for one website?
That shouldn't be a problem. That's something where we try to understand the context of these pages. And if you put everything into headings, then of course it's like nothing is in headings. So that's something where you have to find that balance yourself and say, this is the important heading, and this is everything that belongs under it. And if you do that with a lot of different headings, maybe that makes sense. If you do that with one heading, maybe that makes sense there as well. But I wouldn't just say everything should be a heading.
But in HTML 5, we can use 2 H1 tags. But you said that use only 1 H1 tag.
That's totally up to you. There are sometimes very theoretical discussions on how many H1 tags you can have. For us on Google side, we see that more pragmatically and say, well, we have to take what comes from the web and we have to deal with that. And we're not going to judge like how many H1 tags a page has and say this is bad or this is good.
I have put it up the organization schema markup on my website, but it is not showing up in the Google Knowledge Graph since a long time, and it is showing a wrong location in the Google Maps and the wrong images posted by some like anonymous user that doesn't belong to our organization. So how can I get those images removed? I have already reported those images. And further, how can I get my knowledge graph regarding organization? I already put it up this Wikipedia link and LinkedIn company and in various other social media URLs in the same as that you need.
Yeah,
So
for structured data in general, for rich snippets and knowledge graph, we look at a number of things. So on the one hand, technically it has to be correct. You can check that with the testing tools. Maybe you've done that already. On the other hand, from a policy point of view, the markup has to be valid. For example, if you use recipe markup, you shouldn't use that to markup a hotel. That's one thing we also look at. And then finally, the website itself has to be of high quality, where we can say we trust the markup that's coming from this website. We can just show that in the search results. So those are kind of the three points that we look up when it comes to using structured data on a web page. And it's not always the case that if you implement things correctly, that will always show them. So sometimes you really have to work on your website, and this is something that might take quite a bit of time to really kind of build up this website that's, for us, recognizable as something that's really a trustworthy website that we can pick up and use in search properly.
and from where the Google picks up the data, is it from the Wikipedia or Wikidata, or from where it gets data of this?
For the knowledge graph, I believe there are various sources that come together. So it's not just one place.
And how can I optimize my website for restaurants? Like my website is Zomato, and Zomato, you might be familiar with this. And so I want to create a page for restaurants near me. So in that,
Let me
various categories are like restaurants
just
near me, bars near me.
yeah. Let
So
me run through some of the submitted questions first, and then we'll open it up for more general Q&A from you all as well. But
okay,
a bunch of these questions might have been submitted for a while. So
sure.
sure. Let me just mute you. Bit of background noise somewhere. All right, and next one here. With our e-commerce site, we moved all our duplicate description products to a subdomain with a no index. Once we write some unique content, we move it back to the main domain with 301 in order to keep the domain healthy. Is this a bad practice? I think you can definitely do that. It's not something where I'd say you need to move it to a separate subdomain if you want to set it as no index. For us, if it's no index, it's not indexed. So you could do that within your main domain as well. It's not necessarily something you'd need to separate out into a different subdomain. Google says it will penalize mobile interstitials. Does this mean small widgets in mobile for website personalization will face the same impact, or only for dialogues that cover the entire mobile screen? That's something I take a look at the exceptions and the examples that we have in the blog post and see which one of those matches what you're trying to do there. In general, widgets by themselves can be all different kinds of things. So they could be small, they could be big, they could be something in a sidebar, something in a menu somewhere. So just because it's a widget, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a good or a bad thing with regards to this interstitial change. Can you recap why we should use HTTPS and what the benefits are? So HTTPS has a lot of benefits, I think, and there are essentially three main things that come together with HTTPS. On the one hand, the user knows that they're talking with that server directly. On the other hand, the content that's sent back and forth between the user and the server is encrypted, so no third party can really listen in. And finally, because of all of this setup, the content that's sent from the server is guaranteed to arrive at the user in that state, so it's not modified. That last one is something that we sometimes see when you go to a public or an open Wi-Fi hotspot where you're browsing some random web page, and suddenly there are ads there that you didn't recognize before. Some of these hotspots inject ads. Some of them inject tracking elements into those pages if they're not on HTTPS. So these are the type of things that you, as a webmaster, might not want to have happen with your content. Additionally, it's also something that's de facto required for HTTP2. HTTP2 is a way of sending content in a really fast way. So it can bundle different pieces of content into one request and send that all at once. So that really speeds things up. And finally, if you're using service workers, which is a technology that's used by progressive web apps, particularly to facilitate kind of offline websites, offline web apps, then those service workers also require HTTPS.
I have a question here, John.
Sure.
All right, John, so what if in the case I have a website that is a service providing website? And should I use HTTPS or should I just continue with HTTP normally?
I would always say to move to HTTPS. I think that's something that is a trend that's going to continue happening in the future. And either you move now or you move in a couple of years when essentially everyone is doing that. So that's something where, from my point of view, if you have time to do something like this, if you're doing a revamp of your website anyway, if you're moving domains, then I would just add HTTPS into that as well. So it's not something where you would see a big change in rankings, but it's just a general infrastructure change that is essentially going to happen across the web.
All right, thank you.
Hi, John. Related to the HTTPS questions, when we moved HTTP to HTTPS using 301 redirection, will we have a ranking drop when this shift?
So we pass PageRank for 301 redirect, so it's not the case that there would be anything that would get lost just because it's a 301 redirect. In general, whenever you make site structure changes, which could be going to HTTPS, which could be changing the URL structure, moving to a different domain, you will see some fluctuations for some time. So it's not something where you'd say, well, I could just switch from this to this, and nobody will ever notice a difference in search. It will just automatically happen. You will see some fluctuations for, I would say, a couple of weeks, maybe longer, depending on the website, as we kind of reprocess, reindex, recrawl everything on the website. In the long term, it should settle down to essentially the same state.
OK.
John, do you also look at the entire website being HTTPS versus individual URLs?
Not at the moment.
Because last time, I mean, this was 2 years ago now, last time we went all HTTPS, we saw another big drop in rankings. But I think there are a few people that anecdotally then had the same issue. But I'd like to try it here again in the UK, but I don't want to risk the whole thing. So could we do a dozen products and see what happens, and then
Sure.
slowly move it over. Okay, so it doesn't look at a site-wide, the
Yeah.
whole thing is secure.
Yeah. So for search, we use HTTPS as a ranking signal, but it's a fairly small signal. It's more to kind of balance between things that we think are equivalent. And it's done on a per-page basis. So
Okay,
if
perfect.
those pages are HTTPS, then we'll be able to take that into account. If part of the site isn't HTTPS, that's fine too. A lot of bigger sites do their transition to HTTPS in pieces as well. So it's kind of a normal situation. If you have multiple CMS systems, multiple different backends, then sometimes you do one piece at a time.
Cool.
If a link to a website has a parameter in it, and that parameter is blocked by robots.txt file, will that link lose its ranking value? Not necessarily. So what would probably happen here is this would be like a link to a roboted URL, just a general roboted URL. We don't know what content is on that URL, but we do know there's some context for that URL based on the link, based on the anchor text, where that link is coming from, all of that. So from our point of view, what we will see is people are pointing at a URL on your website. It's blocked by robots.txt. We don't know what's there. So what we'll do is we'll index that URL without the content and try to show that in the search results. So that's something that sometimes makes sense. If there are pages that, for technical reasons, we can't really crawl them because it causes issues on your server, then maybe a roboted URL is fine there. And that's something we could show in the search results regardless. But on the other hand, if you're using the robots.txt file to kind of simplify duplicate content, then that's probably not what you want to have happen. You don't want to have these duplicates showing up in the search results. You want to have Google kind of recognize these duplicates, fold them into one, and make that one URL a lot stronger. So if that's the case, if you're trying to solve a duplicate content problem here, I'd recommend looking at the other ways of handling duplicate content instead. So maybe you can set up a redirect for these parameters. If these are session IDs or something that you don't really care about, maybe you can set up a redirect to your preferred version. You can almost always set a rel canonical to your preferred version. Make sure that, of course, these URLs are crawlable so that we can look at that URL and see, oh, it's the duplicate of the other one that we already have. Therefore, all of these links that are going to this parameterized URL could be combined with that other URL that you have, and we can kind of show that URL a little bit better in rankings. So those are kind of the two aspects there. On the one hand, if you don't want this URL crawled, maybe leaving it roboted is fine. On the other hand, if you're doing this for duplicate content, I would not recommend using robots.txt. I'd recommend using one of the other methods. Regarding HTTPS, does the type of certificate used make a difference? For example, a green bar versus a simple green padlock? No. From our point of view, you can use any of these certificates as long as they're valid certificates. As long as a modern browser shows them as being valid, then they should be fine. There are free certificates you can get out there from various providers. They work just as well. Does Google try to give opportunity to rank over huge corporations like Amazon and Staples for smaller business websites in specific niches? Yes. I think this is something that's kind of interesting about the web in general, in that if you're a small business and you have the ability to focus on something small and unique, something that's really interesting for you, where you have a lot of expertise, where you know there are some users out there on the web, then that's something you can definitely do and kind of focus on that. And you can become the expert in that specific niche. And big companies like Amazon and Staples in this case, they often don't have the time to actually focus on these smaller niches. So that's something where if you can find something small where the small part is big enough for you to really survive well, and you're not competing with something these big companies are doing, then that's a great situation. That's something where I think there's a lot of opportunity on the web. The one thing I'd watch out for is that you're not some small website and you're trying to do exactly the same as these big players are doing and trying to compete essentially on their playing field, because that's something where you as a small player are just going to have a really hard time to actually compete on that level. But if you can find something that is kind of maybe similar to what they're doing, but a focus on a really small and unique area, then I would definitely go for that. Does Google consider social signals to be too much noise to be useful for algorithms? As far as I know, we don't use social signals at all, primarily because we can't crawl them all. We can't look at them all. And when we can look at them, the links are generally with no follow. So that's something where, from my point of view, I don't think we get much value out of this, and we don't really use that. How long does it take for Google to take a page redirect into account for a ranking page? Would fetching as Google speed up that process? We essentially pick up a redirect as soon as we see it. So depending on the page, some of these pages we might crawl every day. Some of them we might crawl every couple of weeks or every couple of months. But when we see that redirect, we can take that into account. We can take that into account for ranking, for picking the right canonical, essentially. So that's something that usually works fairly well. You can speed that up by submitting a sitemap file for those URLs and say, well, these URLs changed since the last time you picked them up, and they happen to redirect. So that's fine. So that's something on a larger scale. Maybe do it with a sitemap file. If this is an individual URL that you're saying, well, this one URL is the one that I've been redirecting, and Google hasn't been picking that up or noticing that, then fetching as Google and submitting to index might be an idea there. But if you're doing this for like site maintenance, if you're moving one site from one domain to another, if you're making bigger, broader changes on your website, then I wouldn't use these manual per URL tools. I would really focus on the broader ones. And if it takes longer to pick up individual URLs and kind of move them to the new domain or the new location, then I would just let that take its time. It's not something where you're going to see a difference in ranking if we show this URL or that URL. Post-navigation redesign, search engine traffic started dropping. When analyzed, we found that the same line, 150 characters, is getting repeated 70+ times in the entire site in all pages because it's added to the navigation. There are a few more lines in the navigation repeated across the site. Is that duplicate content? From our point of view, that's usually unproblematic. So we can recognize things like the navigation, the sidebar, the footer. We try to recognize the main content as well on these pages. And if there's duplication in, we call it the boilerplate, like the navigation, the sidebar, the footer, whatever you have there, then that's something we generally just discount. And from our point of view, that's fine. Normal websites don't have different navigation on every page. It's repeated across the whole website. So that's usually not something I would worry about. On the other hand, depending on what you found there, if this is essentially a collection of keyword stuffing or hidden text that you're accidentally placing on all of your pages, then that's something I'd clean up regardless of kind of what we pick up for navigation. Because if you're injecting that much keyword stuffing into all of your pages, then maybe that's not a great idea. Please say something about Panda. Did it ever roll out since the new score of Panda 4.2? I don't know what is referred to by Panda 4.2, so it's hard to say. But this is something that has been rolling out gradually, and that is updating over time as well. So that's not something where you would see any kind of distinct jumps or changes in the way your website is showing in the rankings. That's something that's kind of gradually flowing out over the search results. So less of something where you would see individual bounces or changes that you could kind of flag as Panda 4.3, 4.31, or whatever they would be counted as. Since I am a training website, having multiple locations for classroom sessions in the US, but the course content would fall the same since the syllabus is common. When I show similar content in all pages, do I duplicate? This is something where you kind of have to balance between providing that content individually for some locations and providing that content in a centralized place for all locations. On the one hand, having that per location makes it a little bit easier for those who are at that location already to figure out what is happening there. On the other hand, having that centralized makes it a little bit easier to make that content fairly strong. So that when we look for someone, or when we have someone who's looking for that type of content, we know, well, this is really strong content that we could show to them. So that's something where you kind of have to balance that out almost on your side with regards to your business, with regards to whether or not you want to kind of limit it to your local pages, or whether you want to make a strong global version that you refer to from your global pages. And some of that might depend on the number of locations that you have. If you have a handful of locations, then maybe keeping that per location is fine. If you have hundreds of locations, then I would definitely just put that into one single place. So for example, if you're looking at a business like, I don't know, McDonald's, then they would have one place where they put their menu, which is the same for probably the whole country. And they list the individual locations, but they don't put that menu on every individual location page. So that's something where sometimes it makes sense to go this way, sometimes it makes sense to go that way. For local business, do you think there's anything they can do to compete in local search? For example, a website for guitar lessons in your city. I imagine guitar lessons are a bit tricky because you might not have one fixed location where you're actually located. But in general, for local businesses, on the one hand, I would focus on the Google My Business listings, where you do get some ability to kind of provide more context about your business, your location, opening hours, all of that. We can pull that into search as well. We can show it in the like local one box. There are probably some SEO kind of tricks that you could do for Google My Business, which I'm not aware of because I don't work with the Google My Business team. But there are lots of really good local business websites and blogs out there that can help you with that. On the other hand, on your website, you can also mark up your location using structured data. You can mark up your opening hours, your phone numbers, for example, using structured data. That also gives us a little bit better understanding of where you're actually located and when you're open, when we can send people your way. So those are kind of the two main pillars I would build on with regards to local businesses. My site has alternate tags for my M site, but Google is indexing sometimes not friendly URLs, like m.page/whatever. If I have the tags properly implemented, should I be worried about duplicate content? In general, you don't need to worry about duplicate content because that's more of a technical issue on our side that we should solve on our side. On the other hand, if you're seeing these M-site URLs in desktop search especially, then that's a sign that we're not picking up that association properly between your desktop pages and your M-site pages. So that's something where I would really double check the implementation there. Make sure you have the canonical set up properly on your M-site pages. Make sure you have the alternate link set up properly on your desktop pages, that you're doing a conditional redirect if you're setting that up properly. And really make sure that this connection between the individual M-site pages and the individual desktop pages is actually working as you would want. This is one of those situations where using responsive web design or using a single URL with dynamic serving has really strong advantages, because you don't have to worry about individual URLs showing up in different locations or being indexed in different ways. So that might be something to think about if you're doing a future redesign. Maybe you can move to something more responsive that uses the same URL for the desktop and the mobile pages. In general, we do support the 3 variations, but we do recommend responsive web design wherever possible, because you save yourself a lot of these hassles of having to worry about what happens with my different URLs, how do they get indexed, what happens if I have links to those URLs, what happens if I have a completely different site structure on those URLs. All of that kind of falls away. Is there any timescale as to when rich cards will be rolled out to products? I'm not aware of what's happening with the rich cards rollout there, so I don't have anything specific to add there. I do know the team is working on that, so it's not something that's completely dropped, but sometimes these things just take longer than we expect. Regarding plans for devaluing pages with intrusive interstitials on mobile, will a large delay before these interstitials appear change the impact on a page's rankings? It sounds like you're trying to be sneaky and showing an interstitial, even though we're saying that this is a bad user experience. So I would kind of be cautious there with regards to just trying to game the interstitial algorithm. If there is a legal reason for you to show these interstitials, then fine. Of course, you can show them. But otherwise, I would try to find different ways to grab the user's attention when they're looking at your pages. Do you have any tips for siloing content? Should you group as much as possible into one Uber resource or split down into subtopics linked from a hub? Both of these are valid techniques. So that's something where you really need to figure out on your side, how much do I want this content to stand on its own, or how do I want to kind of separate it into individual pieces? How strongly do I want to separate it? That's essentially up to you. It's less of an issue from our side with regards to search. We try to pick up the content as you provide it. But specifically with regards to what users are looking for, how they're navigating your site, how they're kind of going through your content and finding what they need and converting to whatever you have to convert to, that's something that you should be looking at on your side primarily. And we'll take whatever you provide for us. So that's less of an SEO issue from my point of view and more of something where you're engaging with your users. I'm seeing some discrepancies in a number of index pages in my site Search Console, which is a single-page app. What would be the cause of this? Would pages be de-indexed quickly if there was a temporary problem crawling HTML snapshots? So there are two things mostly here. On the one hand, the index status report has been stuck for a while. I think it's now getting data again. So that's something that should be catching up again. So if you've made significant changes in the last couple of weeks, then I double-check that report again to see that it's actually being shown. On the other hand, specifically, if you're looking to see which or that your important pages are being indexed, then I'd recommend setting up a sitemap file where you can see the number of indexed URLs per sitemap file in Search Console and focus on those numbers rather than the broader kind of index status or site query numbers. With regards to single-page apps, sometimes that's tricky. So in general, with single-page apps, we have one HTML page, and the JavaScript generates the content that's actually shown. It pulls it separately from the server. So when we crawl that page and just see that one HTML page, all of those pages look the same to us at first. We have to render them before we can actually recognize the content there. And one of the issues that might happen there is if the JavaScript is blocked by Robots.txt, blocked in other ways, then maybe we won't be able to pick up that JavaScript, process it properly, and in the end, it'll look like all of these pages are just the same HTML page. And then we say, well, we can fold them all into one page and just index them like that. So specifically for single-page apps, really make sure that your JavaScript is working well, that it doesn't crash when Googlebot renders it, that Google is able to actually fetch it properly. That's really important there, because we can't just look at the HTML page. We have to actually render the full content to actually get what you're providing. So that's the main issue that I've seen where people have had problems with regards to single-page apps or JavaScript frameworks in general, is that we can't process the JavaScript properly. Therefore, we can't actually index the content properly. In some cases, you might be able to look into pre-rendering these pages and serving us a pre-rendered version, or using, like I mentioned before, isomorphic JavaScript techniques to render this on the server for all users when they come for the first visit, which can provide a significant speed up as well. Why, when using site search on my site, the homepage URL won't show anywhere within the search results, though the page seems fine in regular search for various terms, with one query showing the homepage along with 6 site links to offer to get more results. So oftentimes, we do show the homepage as the first one for a site query, but it's not guaranteed. It's not something that our systems always do. So specifically, a site query is something that we would see as a kind of an artificial query, in the sense that there is no correct ranking for us to provide there. So that's kind of something where it's not really a sign of an issue. If you're not seeing the homepage on your site query search results from the beginning, it's not really something that you need to fix. Do you have any tips on making images more crawlable? For pages with lazy loaded images, are images in XML sitemaps a good idea? We actually double-checked with the team on this week, and they do still pick up images from image sitemap files. So specifying them in image sitemap files like that is always a good idea, or at least still, since we just checked recently. In general, what I'd recommend doing specifically with lazy loaded images is make it so that when we render the page, we at least find a link to that image, even if the image itself isn't rendered, but that there's at least a kind of a static link to that image, so that we can understand this image is embedded in this place on this page, even if it's not shown automatically by default for lazy loading. So that's kind of one workaround that you could do there if you're using lazy loading on individual pages. Yeah, that's kind of what I'd recommend there. I have a single-page app using AngularJS. The text content on my website is getting indexed, but inconsistently. The hyperlinks aren't getting crawled at all, due to which we have to manually submit our newly published content with Search Console. Any suggestions? So that sounds like we're not able to render your pages properly. And that's something where I focus on using fetch as Google, the fetch and render feature in Search Console, to make sure that we can actually pick up the content. What you could also do is set up a kind of a diagnostics page on your site with maybe a no index on it, so that it doesn't get indexed, which lets you pick out to double check that individual pieces of your content are actually being rendered properly. So this is specifically for links, for example. If you want to double check that the href element, the href attribute is being picked up from some of your navigational links, then you could make a page that kind of shows that really large using JavaScript, that you could double check that with fetch and render. The other thing, again, here is to make sure that your JavaScript files are really crawlable and indexable, that any server-side responses that you're pulling in with JavaScript is also crawlable and indexable. So those are kind of the things that I would watch out for there. And if we can crawl and index your JavaScript, if we can render your pages properly, then we will be able to crawl the rest of your website, and you shouldn't really need to manually submit any of this in Search Console. John, you said you don't track if users found what they're looking for on my page. On my page-by-page or domain-by-domain basis, is that correct? We've had a few of these questions, so I'll just skip this one as well. Related to mobile update, we have site for desktop and mobile with different subfolder. Both of them submit a sitemap, but we haven't used rel alternate and rel canonical to link both desktop and mobile. Should we use sitemap or HTML markup for rel alternate? Essentially, both of these are equivalent for us. So if we find the markup properly in your sitemap file, if you're using the way we have it defined in our help center, then that works just as well. You don't need to always put it in the head or always put it in a sitemap. Both of those work for us.
Hi, John. Related to the question, I was wondering which markup is the fastest one. Is using the HTML markup or the sitemap file? Will the Google index faster using the HTML markup than the sitemap?
It should be the same.
It should be the same. OK.
Yeah. With responsive web design, the desire for creating engaging mobile experiences separate to desktop using the same code, wondering whether Google assigns less importance to certain pages depending on how the menu changes on both. At the moment, we focus on the desktop version for indexing because that's the version that you have a rel canonical set to that we think most users are going to see anyway. So that's what we'll focus on for indexing. I could imagine that over time, maybe it'll change, where if we see most users are actually using mobile phones, maybe we should be using the mobile version for indexing. I could imagine. I'd recommend making sure both of these are actually usable properly so that you have a proper menu on both of them that we could crawl the mobile version and pick up all of those changes if we needed to. OK, wow, just 3 questions. Let me run through those really quickly. Any suggestions for Google Sites and rankings? Nothing specific. So Google Sites can show up in search results as well. We do show them. They're essentially normal HTML pages that we can pick up and show. So there's nothing unique, I'd say, you'd need to do with Google Sites. New at type markup, like pending schema.org distillery with canonical distillery is still not recognized by structured data testing tool. Any plans to recognize and thus encourage adoption from pending.schema.org? I don't know what the plans are there. I know we recently enabled, I think, the new schema.org release for structured data testing tool, but I don't know how pending fits into that. How can I check if I did not demote my domain on site links by mistake in Webmaster Tools? You can double check in Search Console to see if it's listed there. If it's not listed there, then you should be fine. It should be set up properly. Yeah, I think we still have a few minutes time for any questions from you all. If there's more on your mind, more left over that we should be talking about, feel free to jump on in.
Yeah, I'm having a question. So,
OK.
but what if we want to target country?
Yeah, John, can I ask one question?
Which one format is will be better? Subfolder or a subdomain or a country-wise CCTLD? So which one will be the most suitable for this?
Hello.
All of those work. So you can set geo-targeting for subdomains and subdirectories. If it's on a generic top-level domain, you can use a country code top-level domain. All of that works.
OK. So if one of my website is penalized by Google, so how can I recover it from that? Should I purchase a new domain or should I regularly post fresh content or something and other practices so that it can recover back?
I would post in the Webmaster Help Forum for that to kind of get advice from peers, because sometimes that's a tricky situation in that either you can clean things up and kind of remove that manual action, or sometimes maybe that manual action is a sign of something so significant that has gone wrong with your website that you might need to clean that up by moving to something else. But in the Webmaster help forum, you can definitely get help on that.
So, what if we, by mistake we disavow the good links also? Will that create any trouble for our website?
Sure. I mean, if you disavow good links, then we won't count them either. So that's something kind of to look into.
Thank you.
All right. Someone else had a question, I think. Yeah. Go for it, Rob.
Oh, no, it wasn't me. I was saying I think it was Niraj who wanted to.
Oh, OK.
But it was.
Go for it, Niraj.
Hello. Yeah, can you hear you?
Yes.
Oh, cool. John, regarding mobile-friendly label in mobile searches, it was just a small kind of question in my mind that I have recently gone through some articles where I saw that people are talking about Google has started removing mobile-friendly label from search result. So, does Google have any plan of adding AMP label instead of mobile pages, mobile-friendly label?
I think we already show the AMP label in the search results when it goes to the AMP viewer. So that's something we already show there. One thing to keep in mind with the mobile-friendly label is this is just the label in the search results that we're removing. The ranking change still remains. So mobile-friendly pages will continue to have that ranking boost.
But
Yeah, I agree with you. But my
this
point was
is
that
Google
for
biased regarding
e-commerce
some
website where
certain
top 10
organizations
links
that
come in
it
first page, mobile-friendly label comes there. So for e-commerce website, is there any chance that Google has started planning that now we will remove mobile-friendly label and add AMP after some time instead of mobile-friendly label?
Well, the AMP label is only for AMP content. So it's not automatically that if a page is mobile friendly that it would be AMP. Some of them are AMP. I think that the AMP label is also a good sign that this will be shown in a slightly different way with the AMP viewer, with the AMP cache, with everything around AMP. That's something that I think will be rolling out to more and more different types of sites as well. So we're at the moment, in the normal search results, we're only showing it in the top stories carousel, so in the news section. But we have an experiment running, a demo where you can try it out, where we'll show it for any page that is in AMP format. And this could be e-commerce pages, it could be product pages, it could be any kind of static type page where you have content that you're providing in an AMP version as well.
Okay, thanks.
All right. One
Hey,
more
John,
question.
related to the
Yes.
HTML, is rolling out for the Asia Pacific, for example, Taiwan or Hong Kong region?
Which feature did you mean?
Taiwan or Hong Kong region.
Yes, but which element is rolling out? I didn't get the first part of your question. Sorry.
I think it's that AMP.
AMP. Yes. So the AMP in the top story section is, I believe, limited by country. It depends a bit on how much AMP content we actually have there, because if there's not a lot of AMP content for a country to show in the news section, then it doesn't really make sense to use that there. But the AMP in the normal search results is available globally. So that will be across all countries and all languages. All right.
Have you found a solution to the Google Hangout?
I haven't had a chance to dig into that. I saw someone else was trying things out with YouTube Live, I believe, and normal Hangouts. Maybe that will be an option.
Is it just the interaction part that's not finalized yet?
The Q&A is something I don't really have a solution for yet.
Just don't take any questions.
OK, I'll just talk about what I want to talk about. That's an option. It might make them a little bit less useful for you. but yeah. I think we'll try a few things out. I'll probably do the existing Hangouts until the last day when we can do them, and then we'll try different things out. So might be a bit rocky, might end up with something that's a bit different than what we're doing now, which is also fine. Sometimes things change. All right. With that, I'd like to take a break here. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for all of the questions. Hope to see you again in one of the future Hangouts, as long as they're available, or in whatever future format, depending on how that happens. And I wish you all a great weekend. Have a good time. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Bye.